Welcome to the Forensicsworld podcast. This is episode 8, and it is part 2 of our Autopsy series, which started in episode 7. My name's Will Dodds, and I'm a retired CSI with 15 years of experience in the discipline and completed a 22-year policing career. So where did we leave off? We left off with our deceased still shrouded and laying on the autopsy theater table, and I was on up a set of rolling stairs leaning over the body to get an overhead overall view or photograph of the deceased before we opened up the shroud. So let's begin from there. So that photograph has been taken. We're ready to go. We're organized, and we're going to get started. So first thing to do is, once we're ready to go, is to unzip that shroud. And that is certainly a moment that can lead to some surprises. You never really know what you're going to find, although certainly you do know you're going to find the deceased, but in what state are you going to find that deceased? But keep in mind that the person has been refrigerated for a few days in preparation and prior to the autopsy, but you can still start to see results of decay starting to kick in. You do get some discolorations. Certainly the process is slowed down significantly as a result of the refrigeration, but you're still going to see changes that come as a result of decay. Now, what do you see when you first open up that shroud? Well, you're going to see what you saw when you first zipped up that shroud. Keep in mind, sometimes you're going to have you're going to find medical equipment left over from emergency interventions or first aid. Typically, one of the things you may find is an intubation tube could still be in place in the mouth and down the throat of the deceased. So this is sort of a situation where there was not, the deceased was not discovered dead, for lack of a better word. So the medical team, police, fire, ambulance attended and did their best to save the person, but were unsuccessful. So that's when you're going to have a situation where you have medical equipment still associated to or attached to the body. Quite often as well, though, you're going to have just the deceased, which had been, found in the state, partially clothed, potentially fully clothed. I'm not one to undress or remove all the clothing from a deceased when I know we're going to be heading to autopsy. I'll go through the pockets to a degree, but I'll know that I'll be able to get that done at a little bit later date. First things first, a lot of photographs. So the deceased is removed from the shroud and placed on, is now on the table, and photograph, and then make a plan with the forensic pathologist is leading the charge for sure. But I would suggest that on the forensic side of things, we are a little bit more involved during these first initial steps, as we go through pockets, as we take photographs, systematic photographs overall, mid-ranges and close-ups. We go through pockets. We look for things like keys or perhaps anything we may find of interest or of note, and we're considering trace exam, collecting of trace evidence, or potentially going to do some swabbing. The forensic pathologist will get started with the external examination. So we're removing the clothing if there's clothing being worn, piece by piece and securing it in individual evidence bags. We're securing items that we may find in the pockets of the deceased, and we're cataloging and organizing those items. There'll be an exhibit officer present who's in charge of documenting the time and the location from where an item comes from. And while this is going on, the external examination has begun. And the external exam, led by the forensic pathologist, starts with some overall observations. Some notes are taken, looking for wounds, looking for injuries, looking for anything of concern. Perhaps some displacement in bones, or who knows what it could be. It all depends on the situation or how the deceased met their demise. The pathologist or the assistant will be taking scrapings under the nails of the deceased, taking samples. One particular one, which is always a bit odd to watch, is when the syringe is used with a needle into the eyeball to remove a sampling of vitreous humor, which is the liquid in the eye, in the eyeball. Not always there if the deceased had been gone a long time prior to being secured and put into the morgue, but usually they're going to be able to get some. Looking for other bodily fluid samples. I'm just doing an overall observation or an external exam, which is that first big step, keeping track of a 2-centimeter stab wound in the left chest or anything along those lines. While that's going on, I'm taking photographs, making some observations, jotting down the odd note. I'm taking photographs of any mark scars or significant mark scars or tattoos for identification purposes. In some cases, I may be taking a couple of fingerprints if identity is still up in the air, but typically we know who we're dealing with when we are at an autopsy. The external exam takes, well, it's hard to say. You don't want to commit to a particular time, but an external exam can take an hour, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less. Certainly a little bit more if we're looking at someone who had been tied up or someone who'd been restrained. If a deceased is secured at the scene and they had been tied up or their wrists had been bound or anything along those lines, we're not going to be taking those wrists and removing tape or removing rope or anything like that at the scene. We're going to be doing all that in the autopsy. So it really varies depending upon circumstances. So that external exam is the first major step in the process. Now, once that is complete, we know what's coming next, and we need to get inside. And the forensic pathologist prepares the body for the internal exam. Keep in mind that the neck has been supported so that the skull and the head is in place. The arms are to the side. Deceased is laying on their back. Gone through the external exam, documented all the injuries, and now it's time to go in. So that classic Y incision is done, and the Y incision, I'm sure there's other ways and other potential cuts that can be made, but that Y incision is one that I've seen done many times, and one that allows access to the thoracic cavity and the organs inside. It's that cut that's made across from one collarbone to the other with a slight V shape to it, and then at the center of that V, which is going down through the sternum area, that cut goes all the way down to the groin area, so you have that Y incision. Skin is peeled back, the different fascia is cut, and you're allowing access to the, from the skin and the epidermis and the dermis layers into the muscle, and you see the fat depending on the makeup of the person. It's really, really quite fascinating. And then lo and behold, you've exposed the ribs. And the ribs, getting at the ribs, you use a tool or a saw of sorts and stuff, and you separate the sternum, and you can either split it down the middle, or what I vividly remember is what looked really just like garden shears or garden tools, clippers, used to the ribs down the left and right side towards the side of the body, allowing for the breastplate to be picked up and removed from the chest, which then exposes the internal organs. Now, we're inside, and I want to say what always seems to jump out at me, or what always did jump out at me once inside, was the color. And you'd think that you'd simply open it up and it would be just a bloody mess. Well, yes, of course, there's going to be some blood, and depending on the situation, that blood could still be, fairly significant. But what you really see is an amazing array of oranges, reds, yellows, sometimes some greenish, bluish hues as a result of decay. But the orange, reddish hues are the shades and colors are talking about, the muscle leaning towards a little bit red. The fatty tissue leans a little bit more towards yellowy orange. Then you have some deeper reds, blood, coagulated blood potentially. You get coagulations of blood and obvious notable marks where there had been some significant trauma, like for instance in a shooting. You would have some obvious blood buildup in that particular area. It's absolutely fascinating, and you know what? At this point, I don't even smell it anymore. Like it's just so involved. You're just so involved in the situation, and so taken by what you're witnessing, and it never ever gets to be boring or routine. That's for sure. Another thing about the smell as well, because the longer you're exposed to a smell, the less you sort of detect it, I guess. So the smell is still there, and you're distracted by what you're doing, and of course you've kind of been somewhat habituated to it. So it's something that you need to be mindful of when it's all said and done and you're finished. I'll talk about that a little bit later. So the organs are systematically examined and removed. Your lungs, heart, spleen, liver, all the big ones, all the classic list of organs. Quite often they all get weighed, and certainly some of the organs always get weighed, where they'll weigh the left lung, right lung, have those in grams as they're removed from the body cavity. And then you get to the intestines, and you get to the stomach, and we have a look inside, but you might see something that looks a bit familiar. Maybe you'll even see some undigested food. I've seen some crazy things inside stomachs, that's for sure. You're just like, wow, well, they had broccoli or something for dinner recently. And the contents are examined, samples are taken, tissue samples are taken, the organs are examined. The pathologist is taking bits and pieces of various organs for tissue analysis and examination at a later date. And so we're looking at a cavity, body cavity. Organs have been removed. We're looking for evidence of trauma as related to potentially injuries on the external exam that are noted, stab wounds, etc., how they damage the interior organs, so you can follow through them. I've seen cases where you would use a tool where you would enter an organ with the tool and it would come out the other side of the organ while it was in place, so you know that the stab was significant and went in 10, 15 centimeters potentially. Every internal exam is going to be a little bit different. Every autopsy is going to be a little bit different, but they do tend to follow somewhat of a routine pattern or a sequence of events in order to maintain being thorough and not missing anything. So the cavity is done, and while this is happening, potentially your autopsy assistant or is preparing the skull for the examination of the brain, and accessing the brain is an amazing feat as well. There's something called a bone saw, and it won't cut you, but it'll make its way through bone. It's a very interesting piece of equipment. It's vibrating is what it's doing. It's a vibrating blade, and the either the pathologist or the pathologist assistant will take that bone saw and prepare it for what's to come. And prior to the bone saw being used, the scalp is removed and it is taken either from the back or the front, the chin area or the back of the skull, and brought either forward or back like a flap. Or I've also seen it open with two flaps where a cut is made in the skin across the top or the crown of the head, and a flap of skin is taken down towards exposing the face, exposing the bones of the face, and exposing the skull with the other section being pulled back. So if you now imagine what you're seeing is a skull cap exposed. The skin has been pulled away or flapped away, and now it's time to use that bone saw. So that bone saw, the sound is distinct, the odor is distinct, that cutting through bone dust or that haze that comes off the bone as that bone saw makes its way 360 degrees around, just approximately above ear level, and all the way around in order to provide the ability to remove the skull cap. And seeing an autopsy, one of the things you will absolutely remember forever is the use of that. It looks like a T, and it has a small, flattish blade, like a flat blade screwdriver on the long part of the T, and then the T itself is a handle, and this is a stainless steel tool. So imagine that blade of that long portion of the T is placed into the crack or the cut that was made by the bone saw. Now that it's in there, the pathologist takes that T and twists it, and the resulting stress pops the skull cap off the brain. In the sound, it's unmistakable, very distinct, and it's like it's hard to explain or describe, but it's a bit of a or a as that skull cap is released from the connective tissue that's keeping it in place over top of the brain. Skull cap is removed, and if you remember a couple of episodes ago, we talked about how we used information from the autopsy to help us find a murder weapon, and that was the ball-peen hammer. So when you do the skull examination and you pull that skull cap off, both on the outside and on the inside, you can see evidence of fractures. You can see evidence of trauma, perhaps even a gunshot wound. You just never know what you're going to see, although you have an idea depending on what has happened. When you actually see it and it all comes together, it's fantastic. So taking photographs along the way, gathering information, taking a few notes, as I said before. At this point, though, it's all about the forensic pathologist and the pathology assistant and the autopsy assistant. They're doing. We're standing by. We're maybe holding a scale up, or to get a scaled photograph of an injury or a brain injury or some trauma. You get a blunt force trauma to the brain or to the skull, resulting in trauma to the brain itself, and it looks like a darker area where there's been some bleeding, and it's quite apparent. So we'll maybe use our scale while we're taking photographs of that, but we're standing by and we're just taking this all in while the pathologist does their thing. The brain is then removed from the skull and it's taken out, and it just always reminds me of a cauliflower, or a head of a cauliflower, and you see the brain, how it's just a weaving of what do you want to call it, brain matter, and absolutely fascinating. It's got structure, but it's soft. It's got it's a little shiny. It's got lots of vascularity. It's just really amazing. Something else, really and truly seeing a brain. So the brain is then basically carried from the skull, put in the scale. It's weighed, and then this also, it reminds me of cutting using a bread knife. The brain is placed on a cutting board, and the pathologist takes a long bladed, quite a narrow bladed, extremely sharp knife, does remind me of a bread knife, and just cuts through and takes sections after section after section of the brain, looking for anomalies, looking for damage or injury, making the way through the brain and cutting through the entire brain. And this cutting process has happened with some of the other internal organs as well, but seeing it done with the brain, it's really quite something. And so the brain is examined, everything is examined, tissues are examined. We're discussing what potentially could have been, cause of death, possibly mechanisms of death. You can make some reasonable assumptions or hypotheses by looking at the injuries and trauma that you've seen. Had the heart had a stab wound through it, any number of possibilities. And throughout this, the forensic pathologists, they're either taking a few notes or they're recording what they're doing to be later analyzed or translated or transcribed, just depending on what their typical procedure is. So we've taken this deceased from the morgue. We've gone through the external examination. We've taken photographs along the way. We've moved into the internal examination. We've taken tissue and organ samples throughout. We've taken trace evidence where appropriate. We've taken identifying photographs, perhaps fingerprints, if identification is an issue at all. And about 2 to 4 hours after we've been started, we're done. And the internal organs are typically placed into a plastic bag or a garbage bag of sorts, and tied up and put right back in the body cavity. And so I've seen on the way out, you have a normal, wonderful looking body ready to go, and then the last thing that gets done is the organs are placed into the plastic bag, placed back into the body cavity. The skull cap is placed, back onto the skull. The flap of skin is typically brought back across, exposing the face again. And either the pathologist or the autopsy assistant does a rough sew job to tidy and bring everything together again. And it's usually it's not even what you would call proper suture material that's used. Typically, it's a pretty aggressive looking needle and some twine. It's not like garden twine or anything, but it looks more like string than suture material. And the body is sealed up. The skull is reassembled in a sense, and lo and behold, an autopsy is done. During the autopsy, typically there's no breaks. We go, 2 to 4 hours straight through, get everything done. For us, doing more than one autopsy in a day would be rare unless it's a double homicide situation. For the pathologist, they would often certainly do a couple a day. That wouldn't be unusual, but I've been through a double autopsy in one day twice. And of course, we had a little break in between, and then we proceeded and did the process over again. So what's happening then is the body is returned to the morgue. We have, now that the autopsy is complete, we're less concerned with maintaining continuity of that because we no longer are collecting any evidence from it. And as is often the case, police will release custody of the body straight into the coroner's office, because the coroner's control, and the family or whomever will take care of the next few steps and how the body is taken care of. So the forensic pathologist has collected a lot of information, a lot of data, and typically would have like a little chit chat before we depart for the day, giving this is what I think may have been the cause, manner, mechanism of death, but they do within a few weeks come up with a more thorough report. And do they then testify in court? Well, sometimes they will to their findings, but oftentimes the report itself will suffice. So that's our autopsy. And as I say, if you ever get a chance to witness an autopsy, I don't know, you just can't say no. You just got to do it. And it's an amazing, amazing situation. And I'll just repeat only one thing I've said before. The color inside the human body is really quite remarkable. Amazing, and never ceases to amaze me. Well, we've got a couple of questions from followers regarding autopsies, and one was sent, and then it goes like this: does every death result in an autopsy? Well, the answer to that is no. Autopsies are It would be take too much time. It would just be would not be cost efficient to an autopsy for every death. If it's a criminal related situation, yes, we will make a request for an autopsy. If it's a situation where the coroner feels it's in the public interest to do an autopsy, then an autopsy will be ordered. But is there an autopsy for every death? That answer is no. Thanks for that question. And we have one more question. Does every autopsy follow the same steps? Now, I'm going to say loosely yes. Are they in exactly the same order? No. I worked with 2, maybe 4 different forensic pathologists in a couple of different cities doing autopsies. And in general, the process was similar or the same, but sometimes the steps were taken a little bit out of order. So you're always trying to confirm your identity. You always conduct the external examination prior to the internal examination. That's why you're looking at clothing, wounds, marks, scars, tattoos, taking your samples, looking through pockets. So that external examination is your first step. Next being your internal examination, and that's when you pay special attention to the organs, the brain, the eyes, the hyoid, and potentially a strangling situation. So an internal examination. Now throughout the autopsy, you're doing tissue and organ sampling, trace evidence. If it's on the outside, typically you're dealing with that before you start cutting into the body. But tissue and organ sampling always is going to be part of it. And throughout, of course, there's going to be photographing, documentation, and the collection of exhibits. And then after it's all said and done and the autopsy is complete, there's, of course, the endless follow-up reports where forensically I would create a report, the forensic pathologist would create a report, and we would meet up with the detective teams and go through what our findings are. So thanks for that question. Well, I think I'm going to wrap up episode 8, and it was fun to take a journey through an autopsy with you guys, and I appreciate your listening, and I appreciate you taking the time to listen to both episode 7 and episode 8 in order to get through what an autopsy looks like and what happens during an autopsy. I'd encourage you, and I appreciate you listening to all of the episodes in the Forensicsworld podcast, and pass on to your friends, family, colleagues, information about the podcast. I'd appreciate you following, liking, making a comment. That would be great. Grab Forensicsworld on Instagram and YouTube and various other social media platforms. And remember our theme, as always, let's learn something today. So thanks very much for spending the time this episode and last episode learning about an autopsy. And we will talk again very soon. So until next time, thank you again.